Today we're doing a sourdough start to finish loaf. This has been such a long awaited episode, but we're excited to dive in. So I'm going to start by measuring my water. I like to warm filtered water to about 85 degrees using my kettle, and I'm pouring out 350 grams of water. I'm going to be measuring things in grams here, not using cups and tablespoons, just for accuracy. And now I'm adding my ripe starter, 50 to 100 grams here. It's nice and thick and floating, and then I'll show you later on in the video how I feed this thing. I'm going to whisk this vigorously until it forms a nice frothy, milky consistency. That way we're dispersing all those beautiful microbes that we've worked so hard to cultivate in our sourdough starter. And then next, I'm going to be measuring out my flour. This is a 500 gram loaf, so I'm using 500 grams of flour. I've been really liking this Hayden Flour Mill's Perfect Loaf Blend. This is specially formulated by Maurizio Leo, who has been a guest on our podcast before. He's just honestly a fantastic sourdough baker. So here we're measuring 500 grams of flour. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the scale from underneath because I don't want to hurt my scale by putting too much pressure on it. This is quite a heavy bowl. I'm going to begin by mixing my flour, water, and starter. This is not technically an auto lease because an auto lease would just have water and flour. But like I said, this is the simplest recipe I can give you. So I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, which is completely fail-proof. Okay, I want you to resist the urge to add more water. You're going to be mixing your dough together and feeling like this flour is just not incorporating. Give it a second, I promise you. If you were to add more water, there's a better opportunity to do so later in the process that I'll point out when we get there. But right now, just focus on getting all of that flour incorporated. It's going to take you a minute. And now we're going to look at this shaggy dough. I love this term because this just points out how weak the gluten is. You can see these strains are stretching and breaking, and there's really no elasticity to the dough yet, but soon after we give this thing an hour to rest in the bowl, you'll see how the dough texture changes. Now, while I'm setting that aside, what I like to do is go ahead and measure out my salt. 1, so that I don't forget to add salt later in the process, which I have done. And 2, so that I can just go ahead and put my scale away. So this particular recipe calls for 10 grams of salt. I really like Jacobsen's sea salt. And then I just set that right on top of my bowl so that I know, okay, the next thing I'm doing is adding salt. All right, let's go ahead and incorporate that salt into this dough after it has rested for an hour. But before we get there, look at this elasticity. This is just basic gluten development that happens naturally just when you let water and flour sit together. I love showing this visual so that you guys can see how the texture of your dough is changing over time. So to add the salt, you can just go ahead, sprinkle it on top, and then we're going to get in there and mash it with our fingers. This is the point where I said if you want to add a little extra water, you can do that now. And what that's going to do is just increase your hydration of your dough. So now I'm going to mash in this salt, and what you're going to be feeling for is feeling those harsh crystals or those granules of salt slowly dissolving into the dough. I like to use fine sea salt here, but if you have a more coarse salt, it's going to take a second longer to work into the dough. I like to do this thing where I'm kind of pulling at it, and you'll see how it's kind of folding onto itself. Sometimes I lift it out of the bowl just to get a good feel for it. Do I have pockets of salt I need to work through? And then once I feel like I've gotten pretty much all of the salt well incorporated, I'm going to cover this thing again, and we're going to let it rest for an additional 30 minutes. So while that's resting, I'm going to show you when I feed my starter. Basically what I do is I take the jar after I've already used fresh starter out of it. You can see there's just a little bit remaining at the bottom. And I add my water. It's not necessarily warm, it's just easier to pour out of this kettle. And then I eyeball the flour as well. So first I like to just get kind of the bits of remaining starter off around the edge of the jar, stirring it up, adding the water. Then I like to use King Arthur flour. I find that just it being so starchy, basically so refined, that it makes my starter do really, really well. So I also like to use it because it's slightly cheaper than some of the artisan flours that I do buy for my actual loaves. It's totally fine to use a different flour for your starter and another flour for your loaf. Now I just eyeball my starter feedings, but if you're more comfortable measuring out, you can totally do that. We have directions in our free guide for feeding your starter and making this loaf. It's all in there. Now I'm going to cover that, put it to this side, and let my dough rest, and we'll come back. Now we're going to perform our first round of stretch and folds, and you're going to see I'm just pulling up a corner, stretching and folding over. It's exactly like what it sounds, but it just seems odd. We're so used to having to get dough out onto the counter and knead it, right? That's how we always envision bread being baked, but with sourdough it's just a little bit more of a delicate process. So I do 3 stretch and folds, and then sometimes I just like to flip the bread onto itself because it makes it a little bit cleaner, and that way it's got a smooth edge so I can kind of gauge how far it's relaxing, and then I leave it there for another 30 minutes. Now we're coming back. This time I'm going to demo what's called a coil fold, where you're basically lifting the dough from the middle and folding it onto itself. It's a little hard to see here just because that dough is still pretty tight. It hasn't fully relaxed yet, but what's interesting is that throughout this video you're going to continue to see the dough texture change. So that was my kind of little mini coil fold here. It is in a deep bowl, so it's hard to see, but for this next round I think you'll see a bigger difference. Here's my next coil fold. Again, we're giving 30 minutes rest to this dough between each of these. Look at that stretch now though. That is what we're talking about. So as this process goes on, there's gluten forming, there's dough relaxing, there's microbes working to ferment. The whole thing is just a beautiful orchestra that we are just lucky to take part in. And one more time, I'm going to demo a classic stretch and fold again, just because my dough is even stretchier now. You can see that elasticity is there. This is just what time does. It really is incredible. It never fails to amaze me. You know, time is just one of the unspoken ingredients in the sourdough recipe. So don't underestimate what can happen in 30 minutes or an hour. Now we're going to be shaping our dough so we can put it in its proofing basket and it can proof in the fridge overnight or do what's called a cold proof. Now I'm wiping down the counter and putting flour. You don't need this much. I did go a little heavy-handed with the flour, but that's okay. I'm going to gently pull this dough out of the bowl. At this point it's been fermenting kind of all day for at least 5 or 6 hours. I'm going to be stretching it, kind of flattening it out so that I can do what's called like an envelope fold, which is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to be taking it from the bottom and folding it up and then kind of holding and pressing there, and then we're going to take the edges and fold them over, hold and press there. It's hard because I have a lot of flour on the dough here. Hold and press there, and then we're going to be lifting up the top and kind of rolling it. If I didn't have so much flour here, this would have stuck easier, but you know, it is what it is. This is not going to be a perfect showcase, but the loaf that comes out is incredible. So I hope that's an encouragement to everyone else. You don't have to be a perfect baker. I am using our Hazelmere Goods cotton coiled proofing basket. This is the 9-inch oval to create a batard or oval loaf. And I like to flour the top of the loaf as well as inside the basket. Usually there's some residual flour from the last time I baked, but I recently washed this, so it is a fresh proofing basket. So I'm just going to shake some flour in there, make sure that we don't have any sticking problems. Since it is cold proofing overnight, the top of my loaf is nicely floured. She's going to go in, and then we're going to kind of do like a little press and seam. Again, I'm sort of making up for the fact that this is a very floury loaf, but I do want to make sure that this dough holds together. So I'm just, you know, sealing up the seam a little bit. And then I'm going to cover it with a wet cloth. This is not just damp, that this is going to be a wet cloth so that it stays nice and hydrated overnight in the fridge. And then we're going to tuck her away and we will bake in the morning. Now I know you guys are wondering how the heck I'm going to get all this flour off, so just to show you, I do like to use my stainless steel bench scraper to just kind of get all of that flour off of our stone countertops, and then I just do a quick wipe with a washcloth and it's all good to go. So here we are the next morning. This is cold proofed overnight. I'm going to show you what it looks like to flip the dough out onto my parchment paper, which has obviously been used a time or two before. Comes out beautifully, and we've got some flour on the top. I am going to sprinkle a little more flour just because I like a really strong distinction in my scoring. Now you can use rice flour here, but I'm just using regular flour because I don't have any rice flour on hand. And I'm just going to hold a razor blade in my hand. I'm not even going to use a bread lom. I just find I have better control with the cuts. So I'm going to do some decorative cuts. These are not essential to the opening of the loaf, but they make your loaf look pretty. So I'm just doing a basic flower pattern here. My arm is kind of covering it, but basically I'm just making little tiny divots in with just the corner of that razor blade. I'm really not using the long side of the blade at all. I'm going in there with the corner, doing a third wheat stalk, and then I'm going to show you, because everyone does a wheat stalk, I really like what I call kind of like a sunburst. I'm going to show you what that looks like on the side. I basically go one slice up and down and then like rays of sun all around, just to create kind of that, you know, horizon sunrise that you might envision. And then next, after this, we're going to do the critical score, which is going to be the large score that helps the bread open up when it's rising. So because we are baking this in a covered dish with lots of steam, this bread is going to want to rise and expand. And if there's no large cut like you see me doing here, it's going to just burst at whatever the weakest point is. We don't want that to happen. We want it to open up with a nice oven spring in a controlled way. So I usually do one slit all the way down the bread. I might come back through a second time. Then sometimes I take the blade and just kind of lift the top just to ensure that we're going to get a nice clean edge. Here you can see we are all scored, and I have already had my Dutch oven preheating in the oven at 500 degrees at this point. I'm getting it out very carefully with oven mitts on my hands and setting that bread into the piping hot Dutch oven, covering it, and then I'm going to bake that in the oven at 450 degrees for 20 minutes. Now here's the starter we fed earlier in the video. This has been about 12 hours later, and she's nice and bubbly, ready to go. Now is the moment of truth. Did the bread rise like we wanted it to? Yes, beautiful oven spring. Now we're gonna bake it again for another 20 to 25 minutes so it can get golden brown. And here we are, fast forwarding again. I love the speed of this YouTube sourdough life. This bread is done, y'all. We're gonna use our oven mitts to carefully get this out of the piping hot pan. Please do not forget that you need your hands covered at all times. Beautiful scoring is really accentuated by that flour contrast. This would be a little bit brighter here if I had flour on the edge, but either way, look at that beautiful opening. Gorgeous bread. We're going to let this rest on a cooling rack for at least an hour and then cut into it. One more final glance at this intact, beautiful, gorgeous loaf before we cut right down the middle. It's still steaming a little bit. Look at that, beautiful. We see a nice even crumb. It's soft, the outside is crunchy and crispy. It's fully baked through. I have found that with these artisan loaves, we're gonna have a little bit of a tighter crumb like this, but the texture is phenomenal. And there you have it, the easiest sourdough recipe.